Good afternoon, or good morning in some cases. I'm Trudy Murata. I'm a volunteer community ambassador with AARP Virginia here in Virginia. And from our earliest beginnings, AARP has championed lifelong learning. And that's why AARP is thrilled to bring you our third year of Tuesday Explorers, a lifelong learning program offered every Tuesday from January through the end of April at 3 o'clock Eastern Time for all of our curious explorers. For more than 60 years, AARP has been a wise friend and a fierce defender, helping individuals to ensure that their money, health, and happiness live as long as they do. AARP has earned a reputation as a wise friend and a fierce defender through trusted information, tools, and advocacy designed to protect the health and financial security of older Americans and empower them to choose how they live as they age. By promising to act as this wise friend and fierce defender, AARP is helping individuals who are 50 plus and their families feel confident, in control, and secure as they age. As a wise friend in your corner, AARP helps you protect yourself and your loved ones from frauds and scams, get healthy and stay healthy, care for loved ones, make connections, plan a trip, learn new technologies, attend a class, and have fun, just like what we're doing today with our Tuesday Explorer programs. So I hope you'll continue to take advantage of all the opportunities and more that we offer. Today we have with us authors Veronica Li and Sverrir Sigurdsson to discuss the essential elements of memoir writing. This husband and wife team draw on their experience in writing two memoirs, Across the Four Seas, A Chinese Woman's Search for Home, and Viking Voyager, an Icelandic memoir. And they hope to inspire you and others to write down their personal stories. Veronica has worked as a journalist for the Asian Wall Street Journal and as a project officer for the World Bank and is currently a writer. Sverrir grew up in Iceland and has graduated as an architect from Finland. He pursued an international career that took him to the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and the United States. So please join me in welcoming Veronica and Sverrir, and I will turn the program over to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Trudy. And hello to everyone. I'm Veronica Li.
And I'm Sverrir Sigurdsson. We are a husband and wife team. We've been married for 32 years. And so far we have written one book together, my memoir.
After the book came out, many of our friends asked us, are you two still married? As some of you may know, working in close quarters with your spouse can be a recipe for disaster. Fortunately for us, the joint project worked out because we are complete opposites in personality and upbringing. Because we are so different, we complement each other in strengths and weaknesses. As Trudy mentioned, Sverrir is from Iceland and an architect by profession. I am Chinese, originally from Hong Kong, and have worked as a journalist and a caregiver for my parents. We met while working at the World Bank, which is part of the United Nations and located in DC. I have also written a memoir on my own, but it's not about me. It's a story of my mother's life.
We will now talk about our experience with writing our memoirs and what we have learned about this category. First of all, did you know that there is a difference between memoir and autobiography? A memoir focuses on one aspect of life and offers the reader an in-depth exploration. For example, you had a great time in college and want to write about it. Or it can be an ordeal that you went through and so on. You can have many memoirs about different aspects of your life. You can think of your life as a pie, and a memoir is a slice of that pie. Now, an autobiography is the whole pie. It's the person's life history and covers all the essential elements of his life. It's like a scrapbook in which pieces of life are pasted. It gives you room to discuss whatever is important to you. And unlike a memoir where you need to stick to a certain subject, sometimes they overlap, so I wouldn't worry too much about the definition.
Now, let me talk about the most important ingredient of a memoir. It is called the theme. The theme is an idea or message that pervades a work of art or literature. Let me give you an example from my book, Journey Across the Four Seas. As I said before, it's about my mother's journey. This is a picture of my mother when she was 30 years old. Isn't she pretty? My mother loved to tell stories of her life. I thought it would be good to tape her for posterity. So over the course of a year, we sat down together from time to time to record her. I had heard these stories many times in my life, but hearing them in chronological order was a revealing experience. A theme began to take shape. My mom had moved from place to place all her life. Sometimes the cause was external, such as war. When Japan invaded Hong Kong in 1941, she fled to China as a refugee. Other times, the cause was internal, such as my father's paranoia. He always thought disaster was going to strike, and he would want to move before it happened. It's hard to blame him because he had gone through many wars and unrest during his life. But I think at the bottom of her constant moving was her childhood. She lost her father when she was very young. The family became so poor that all 5 of them had to cram into one room. Her longing for a better home became the driving force in her life. So the theme was clear. It's my mom's search for home. And that is how she and the family ended up in the US.
My search for a theme is a long story, and I'll start from the beginning. Now, this is my memoir, Viking Voyager, an Icelandic memoir. I was born in Iceland and grew up reading the Icelandic sagas. Many of them are about the overseas adventures of my forefathers. So from a young age on, I wanted to travel. I guess this wanderlust is built into my Viking heritage. I left home at 19 to study architecture in Finland. After graduating, I decided to go on a 3-year plan to see the world before I went back to Iceland. 3 years turned into 60 some years, and I visited 60 countries and worked in 30 of them. But I never completed my original plan, which was to go back to Iceland. When I told stories of my travel adventures, my friends, their reaction was often, "Why don't you write your memoir?" So I started putting down memorable trips and saving them in a folder called Episodes on my computer. It's like dumping photos into a shoebox. Then I showed a few snippets to Veronica, who had published her own her mother's memoir and other books.
This was during his retirement and after he's done everything he wanted to do. I was going to just pat him on the back and say, "Good job, carry on," just to give him something to do. But after 10 pages or so, I said to him, "Sverrir, you really had an interesting life. I had heard bits and pieces of his travels before, but I didn't realize how extreme they were. until he connected the dots for me. That was when I decided to help him turn his episodes into a book.
At the same time, we didn't want to write a travelogue. A good memoir should tell a story that reveals who the author is, what is his inner drive. And for me, the question is, what is the inner drive that makes me take on these extreme travels? What makes me a modern-day Viking? This became the theme of my memoir.
After you have a theme, you can work on the storyline or plot. It's the main events of a story presented by the writer as an interrelated sequence. I like to think of each episode as a building block for developing the theme. My mom had told me lots of anecdotes from her life. I had a hard time deciding which ones to use. The theme became my guide. It provides a framework to hang the anecdotes on. Those that were not relevant were left out, while those that bring out her longing for a good home were ramped up. When describing incidents crucial to the theme, you have to slow down and develop the scene to the fullest. I will give you an example later.
You can be creative with your storyline. There is no formula for it. It can be in chronological order, or you can jump back and forth in time. Or you can go back to the distant past. That is how I started my story. My chapter 1, called The Sea, was about my grandfather on his last and fateful fishing trip. Here is his ship. He was the skipper of a sailing fishing vessel, and his crew would be out in the North Atlantic for weeks at a time. The weather was cold and sometimes stormy. Many fishermen lost their lives at sea. The reason I started my story with the distant past was I wanted to show that I am who I am because of all the people who have paved the way for me. Life is a relay, every leg a continuation of the previous one. I felt that to understand myself, I had to understand those who have gone before me.
Now, let's talk about the essential elements for a plot. When you read a novel, you expect these elements. The hero of the story faces a problem, he struggles, and the story ends with revelation and resolution of the problem. And the hero has grown older and wiser. He is not the same person as when the story started. A memoir should also have these elements. A memoir tells a story too. The only difference is that the characters are real and the happenings are real too. Here are some other techniques to make your memoir powerful and exciting. One is to place readers in the scene, or better still, in your shoes, by providing details of physical surroundings and the emotional journey. My first book is a spy thriller set in Somalia. I used to work there. I went to great lengths to lay out the details. I described the place, the people, I planned the plot, built up tension and climax, and so on. But when I was writing my mom's memoir, I didn't do any of that in my first draft. The reason was I was mostly transcribing what my mother told me, which was a lot of, I did this and I did that. Then I showed a draft to an editor. Her comment was that my mother's life was very exciting, but the way it's told as an account doesn't do it justice. She pointed out that for a memoir to be convincing and absorbing, it has to have all the ingredients of a novel. So during the rewrite, I pretended I was writing a novel. The facts were given. I didn't alter them, but I did go back to my mom to ask for more details. Now, I am going to read a scene that I fleshed out because it's very important to the theme. My mom's father was a trader who traveled all over China and Southeast Asia. He died of pneumonia far away from his home in Hong Kong at the age of 33. He was quickly buried in his hometown in China, and there was no service for him until a year later. My mom was 4 at the time. And this is the first time she realized her father was dead and her life wouldn't be the same. This was when her search for a home began. I will read to you an excerpt from her book, and the person speaking is my mom. People filed in, bowing to father's portrait and shaking incense at him. When my turn came, mother nudged me toward the altar. She had taught me what to do: clasp the incense in both hands away from my eyes and make 3 deep bows. But as I stood in front of the altar, her instructions left me. Father's eyes gripped mine. The chanting and wailing faded into the distance. Father and I were the only people in the room. We were face to face, chatting quietly. I told him I wanted to touch him, his open face, strong square jaws, and shock of black hair. He said he wanted to touch me too. It had been a long time since he'd done that. I told him to come back from Bangkok or Shanghai or wherever he was. He thought about it for a while. Then he replied with a look so sad that even a 4-year-old could grasp the message. Take a bow, mother hissed at me. My body bent over, slowly and deeply. A teardrop stained the fabric of my shoe. For the first time, I understood what the crying was about. My father was never coming back. My father was dead. Now, this is a life-changing event for my mom. Because of that, I wanted to lay out the scene as if it was happening in real time. It was amazing how much she remembered, but of course, she couldn't remember exactly at what point she realized her father was dead. So I took some creative license to build up to that point. We will talk more about creative license later.
In my memoir, the day I left home was crucial to my Viking career, which is the theme of my story. It's like a Viking's maiden voyage. Because this trip is so important, I tried to take the readers with me on the plane ride to Finland, where I was going to study architecture. At the time, I didn't know a word of Finnish, which is a very difficult language. And to bring the readers along with me, I tried my best to capture the ups and downs of the trip. Let me read what I wrote. On the day of departure, reality pulled my soaring spirits back to earth. My flight was delayed. When I finally boarded the plane 2 hours behind schedule, my stomach was churning with worry. Am I going to miss my connection from Copenhagen to Finland? My fear came true. I missed my flight in Copenhagen. I nervously approached an SAS staff. To my relief, she understood my textbook Danish. My best high school scores were in Danish, but I had never used it on a real Dane before. Without ado, the attendant put me on my cardboard suitcase on a plane bound for Stockholm with a connection to Finland. Communicating in Swedish in Stockholm was somewhat more demanding because I had never taken lessons in the language. I had only picked it up studying physics from a Swedish textbook. But in the end, it worked just fine. With a ticket to Helsinki in hand, my spirits were soaring again until I settled into my seat on the Finnair plane. Suddenly, I felt truly alone. Everyone around me was speaking a language that sounded like gibberish to me. I couldn't pick out a word that shared a common root with any other language I had encountered. Even the dress code of these passengers seemed alien. The women were draped in long, colorful skirts, and the men sported flamboyant vests and jackets. I had no idea at the time that they were gypsies.
As you can see, providing details about the physical surroundings is important, but equally important is the emotional journey going on inside the character. I think Sverrir has something to say about that.
Oh, yes. While we were writing the book, I was very annoyed when Veronica kept asking me, how did you feel about this or that? For example, when I was 12, my mother came down with polio. How did I feel about it? Of course I did. Couldn't have felt good about it, but it was such a long time ago. How could I remember? But Veronica prodded me for details on how I took care of my mom. I dug into my memory and found that I did remember certain things, and so we put together this scene. My mother, my strong take-charge mother, became helpless as a baby. Her leg muscles were paralyzed. The doctor visited regularly, but there was no cure for polio. The only treatment were time, hope, and love. Everyone in the family pitched in. Since I attended school in the afternoon, my last year in primary, I was mom's nurse in the morning. I did the daily grocery shopping, lugging home a pail of milk in one hand and in the other a whole fish strung on a wire threaded through the ice. I cleaned and gutted the fish, cut it into steaks, and boiled them together with potatoes. Before I left for school, I shared with Mom the lunch I had cooked. She ate in bed while I sat on a chair munching glumly by her side. Mom often apologized for being a bother to us. Other than that, she said little, her lips clamped tight and thin. Dad and Gusta took over when they came home in the afternoon. Christian, then 5, was left on his own much of the day. My mother was nothing if not determined. Gradually, she got out of bed and took one baby step after another, hanging onto furniture and walls. We were all rooting for her in our hearts. Our stoic culture frowns on any outpouring of emotions, but I'm sure our silent cheering didn't go unnoticed. Mom pushed ahead. After about 6 months, she could walk again. Our mother was back, cooking, cleaning, taking care of everyone as before. Except we knew she would never be the same. She tired easily and could no longer go hiking with us.
I think that is a very touching scene. It's not gushing with emotions. The feelings are subdued, but they are no less powerful. It also reveals the family dynamics and the stoic, reserved nature of Icelanders. Now let's talk about creative license. Okay, it is bending the facts to create artistic effect. The purpose is to bring out the truth, not to distort it. Sometimes you can dig into your memory and find the information you need, but there are times when it's not possible. You can always do research or ask somebody who may remember, or use your imagination. As long as the purpose is to bring out the truth, not to distort it, that is perfectly fine. Dialogue is a form of creative license. Nobody remembers word for word what somebody said 50 years ago. But if we remember the point the person made, we can recreate the quote. It livens the story when we can hear the voice of the person speaking. Here is an example from my mom's memoir. Back when she was a child, Chinese girls were not supposed to go to school. But she got lucky because a family friend was a school teacher and got her enrolled. Later, at the age of 13, my mom applied to a famous school in Hong Kong called Italian Convent, which was an English medium school. Since Hong Kong was a British colony then, learning English was essential for getting ahead. I will read you the interview with the principal, Mother Angelica. After studying my report card, the nun said, "Do you have an English name?" I understood that much English to reply, "No." The nun scribbled on a slip of paper and handed it to me. "Flora," she said slowly, "this is your name." Mother Angelica went on speaking in the incomprehensible language. From her friendly manner and the name she gave me, I guessed that I'd been accepted. I reported to class the following Monday. The week went by without anyone acknowledging my presence. The homeroom teacher, a Portuguese woman, called everyone's name except mine. I wanted to ask her about it, but that would mean using my meager English. I fretted a long time before getting up the courage. "What's your name?" she said. I rummaged in my pocket and pulled out the piece of paper on which the nun had written my name. "Flora Li," she exclaimed. "I've been calling your name all week and you didn't respond." The truth was, I didn't recognize my name.
I have a dialogue for you. This was during my second year in Finland. I was still struggling with the language, but this changed very quickly after I got a job at a company where nothing but Finnish was spoken. Here are three of my colleagues chatting among themselves while working. "Did you hear that Pekka has started working for Alvari?" said the colleague on my right. Alvari was the nickname of Alvar Aalto, the father of modern Nordic architecture. "Yeah, Pekka wants to become a mini Alvari. Poor guy. He is not going to be paid shit," said the fellow in front of me. Alvari was known to pay his underlings next to nothing for the privilege of serving him. Moments later, a colleague said to another, "Have you seen the design of the stupid urinal? It looks as if you're peeing in a rubber boot." Everyone laughed, so did I. I understood what he said, and in fact, everything that my colleagues batted at each other, the jokes, the serious discussion about load-bearing walls and window details, and the gossips about bosses, fellow workers, and girlfriends. I understood everything. A month into total immersion at KK or Kulutus Oski, Osus Kuti and Keskus Lito, I could say, "Puhun Suomea," I speak Finnish. These remarks were bits and pieces that I had overheard at some point in time, but I put them all together to create this scene.
Okay, now let's talk about historical context. A person does not exist in a vacuum. A person's life is like a peephole. You look through that hole and you see a much larger picture. My mother's life is a peephole into Chinese history. I will never forget these dates. December 8, 1941, Japan attacked Hong Kong, and my mother fled to mainland China. Does the date ring a bell? The morning of December 8 in Hong Kong is afternoon of December 7th in the US because of the time difference. And December 7th, 1941 is Pearl Harbor. The Japanese launched an all-out attack on the US and UK at the same time. 1949, the communists took over China and my parents fled from Hong Kong to Thailand. That's why I was born in Thailand. We moved back to Hong Kong several years later. 1966, Chairman Mao started the Cultural Revolution in China. There was unrest in Hong Kong, and my mom applied for immigration in the US. There's so much regional and world history in one person's life.
I have got my war stories too. May 10, 1941. In the wee hours of the morning, British warships sailed into the harbor of Reykjavik and invaded Iceland. This was after Hitler had taken over Denmark and Norway, and the Allies were worried that German troops would take over Iceland and use it as a stepping stone to North America. I was 1 year old at the time. So the first 5 years of my life was spent in a war zone. This is a very important part of my personal story and also an important part of my country's story. Before World War II, few people had heard of Iceland, an island close to the North Pole. But when the war started, the world realized the geopolitical significance of Iceland. This status brought Iceland plenty of economic windfalls. In the second half of my memoir, where I write about my Viking adventures, I try my best to bring out the recent history and culture of the places I was working in. The chapters about my studies in Finland describe the courage and resilience of the Finns during their wars with Russia, much like what is happening in Ukraine today. In Africa, where I lived for 6 years, I wrote about life in two newly independent nations, Malawi and Swaziland. They represent the new post-war order. Colonialism was passé. In the next few decades after the Second World War, 50 new countries were established in Africa alone.
Here is one more element of memoir writing, introspection, which is looking into yourself to examine your motives, values, why you did what you did. If you don't look into yourself, it's very easy to fall into the trap of blaming everything that went wrong on somebody else. My mom was like that when she was being taped. She blamed every mishap on my dad. So I sneaked up on her, usually when we were doing something together, like cooking. She wouldn't be talking into a tape recorder then, so she would feel freer to say things. During these conversations, she would be willing to admit her own weaknesses and take some responsibility for her life. This fairness is very important because otherwise the reader wouldn't trust her. They'll see her as vindictive, trying to get even with her husband.
I'm afraid Veronica forced me to do my share of soul searching. I was going to dismiss my former wife as crazy and not mention her again in my memoir. But Veronica pointed out to me that me and my ex were married for 20 years, and definitely she played a role in my Viking career. As you can imagine, this is a thorny subject. Veronica and I talked about it and decided to devote a chapter to describe in a sympathetic way who my ex is and where she comes from. I also looked into myself and my own shortcomings and the strain of our nomadic lifestyle on the marriage.
This takes me to the subject of writing about living people. This can be touchy because you don't want to offend anyone. In my mom's memoir, many of the people she talked about were already dead, although I had to change the name of one living person. The biggest problem was my dad. He was still very much alive and I couldn't let him read my mom's complaints about him. So I just didn't tell him there was such a book. The people I had to worry about were my siblings. There are 5 of us, and the leader of the gang is my big sister, Agnes. I involved her in every step of the writing process. So when the book came out, Agnes approved, and nobody dared object. The book actually turned out to be a catharsis for the family. We all know there was something wrong with my dad. We just didn't want to admit it. In spite of his problems, he was a very good father. We also knew that our mother was the pillar of the family, and we're all very grateful to her. The book is a tribute to her.
One living person I have to watch out for is my ex-wife. Fortunately, she lives in Sweden besides what if she reads it. If she wants to give a different account, she is free to write her own memoir. The other people I have to worry about are my 2 children. When my son was visiting me from Sweden, he went over my manuscript and gave me positive feedback. My daughter, however, was rather upset about the book. She was very young when her mother and I divorced, so she didn't know all the gory details. Now she knows, and we still have a very good relationship.
If we haven't said enough to inspire you to write your memoir, let us tell you about the rewards we got from memoir writing. When my parents moved in with me, they were in the 80s then, my mom was a bitter woman. I was shocked. The mother I grew up with was sweet and cheerful. What happened to her? I began to understand as I started recording her stories. She was one of the first women to attend Hong Kong University. She could have gone far. But in those days, there weren't many jobs for women. And after she started her family, she had to stay home and take care of the children. My father was another cross she had to bear. She sacrificed so much for her family. And now, at the end of her life, she felt she had nothing to show for it. A big change came over her after her memoir was published. She even presented it at a local library. Here she is. Look at her. She was 88 years old and still looking great. Well, ever since the book came out, I hadn't heard her say one bad word against my dad. I think it's because she finally got the recognition she deserved. But the people who really benefited the most are the clan. This is a picture taken 30 years ago showing 3 generations of our clan in America. This is my mom, my dad, and these little ones here are now parents. So the 4th generation have arrived. And if they want to find out where they came from, all they have to do is read the great-grandmother's memoir.
For me, it was gratifying to wrap up my life. Looking at events in retrospect as an older and hopefully wiser person, I can see how they shaped my personal development. I've been lucky most of my life. My memoir is an upbeat story about my Viking career. Writing it makes me appreciate my good fortune of being in the right place at the right time. I feel like an old Viking telling stories of his life's exploits and the fortunes he has found. I definitely have found my fortune. I don't mean money and riches. The treasures I found were the opportunities to stretch my potential, the experience I have had, the sceneries I've seen, and the people I have met.
On this note, we will conclude our presentation. Thanks very much for listening. And I hope you all start writing your memoirs tonight. We'd also love to hear from you. You can visit us at our website, veronicali.com. The site shows all our books. These two are the memoirs that we just talked about. This one, Confucius Says, is a novel based on my experience of caring for my aging parents. And I am most grateful to AARP for letting me share my caregiving story. This one is my thriller set in Somalia. And all these books are available on the website and also on Amazon.com. You can also email us at our email addresses. We would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories and sharing your memoirs with us as well. We did have a couple of questions in both the chat and the Q&A box. The first question is, what comes first, an autobiography or a memoir, and what are the differences?
It's a matter of you deciding what you want to write. If you want to just write about one experience, then you would call it a memoir. Then you would be writing a memoir. If you want to write about your life in general, then you would be writing about pieces or events and things that are important to you throughout your life. And you would call that an autobiography. And sometimes you don't know. You start out not knowing what you want to write, but you have certain memories, certain personal stories that you want to tell. Then go ahead, put it on paper, even in bits and pieces. After a while, I think a thread will come through and you will realize what exactly you want to write, what your story is. And therefore you can decide whether you want a memoir or autobiography.
Very good. How do you get the history portion of it when the history keeper has passed away?
Let me try to answer that. Firstly, there are books, there are records, there are other people you can ask. You can dig into your own memory. And when all else fails, you just make up the threads that stitch the whole thing together. But that is a little bit of cheating. So I wouldn't really recommend starting with that. But basically, try to figure out what records are there in existence and go from there.
Yeah, newspaper articles is a great resource, especially if it's an event that would have been written about. So when he started his story, which is his grandfather going on his last trip in the North Atlantic, and then when the accident happened, it was in the newspapers, and he dug up the papers and found it. So it's a lot of research into records, and there are records out there that can give you information.
In my case, so happens Iceland is a small place, and every newspaper since the beginning of newspapers back in the mid-1900s has been digitized and is online in a searchable format. So that is a huge resource for anybody writing their memoirs or otherwise.
And Veronica, to you specifically, how much historical research did you need to do to write your mother's story?
Not that much, because my mother told me everything. I was so lucky. I mean, if everybody should be so lucky. So I'm saying to people who still have their parents around, talk to them, make them tell you their life. I mean, record them. Do whatever you can to get the stories out of them. So I was very lucky. So the only research I had to do was basically to give myself the background when she talked about the war, the Japanese attack on China and all that. It was not what everybody knew. There were some skirmishes and attacks that happened before they were officially at war during the Second World War. So I had to do a little bit of research, just to educate myself so that when I write, I would have it in the back of my mind, what is going on. And sometimes just to double check on my mom, she told me about her journey throughout China, from this city to that city to that city, and then I found that, so I traced all the cities, and then I found that she backtracked. So she got mixed up, which is totally understandable. So I fixed that. Instead of having her turn back, I just kept her going.
In my case, I would say the most difficulty I had was tracing my parents' history from young age to adulthood. And I kicked myself today that I didn't ask them at the time. I guess I was either too shy or thought it wasn't important at the time. But that period is kind of a bit opaque for me. And I therefore encourage everybody to start talking to their still living parents, even if you are not yet writing your memoir, but either tape it or write it down in whatever format. Put it into a folder in your on your computer, forget about it for a while, and then 10 years later, maybe you will start writing your memoir and you will be thankful for this particular advice.
Yeah, just recently I've started thinking about all the things that I should have asked my grandparents while I had them here and didn't take advantage of it. Another question we have is it difficult to get your memoirs published?
Well, this is not our first book, so I have some experience. I tried the conventional way. I always try that first, which is to get an agent. In order to publish with a conventional publisher, you have to go through an agent. So I went through the works and of course got rejection letters left and right, which is okay. And I knew the backup plan, which was either small press, hybrid publisher, print on demand, self-publish. So we went through it step by step. And the one thing we ran into was a hybrid publisher close to my home in Fairfax called Mascot Publishing. And we actually went to visit with them and found that they are a very respectable publisher. And we talked to the editor and we looked at their books and everything was very well done. And so we decided to go with them. And a hybrid means you have to pay something. You share the costs. They do certain things, and then they pay for certain things, and you pay for other things. So that's why it's called a hybrid.
In my case, when the English version had come out, a publisher in Iceland got interested in the story. And I actually translated the book myself with the help of an editor. And this is traditional publishing. The publisher basically took care of everything except for the writing. So we have everything from sort of print on demand until into traditional publishing in our stories.
I see. You know, I have a deal with my best girlfriend that if anything happens to me, she's supposed to come and get my journals. And if anything happens to her, I'm supposed to get her journals. Did either one of you keep journals throughout your life?
I definitely never did. As I said, I started writing down sort of bits and pieces at a certain stage. I'm also a bit of a pack rat, which means that I have all sorts of odd documents. When I left the World Bank, for instance, I took all my chronological files with me, and so I can go back to a certain period of time and see what I was up to in those years. And other things, for instance, my old passports filled with stamps, which tell you the date and the place where you crossed the border somewhere, and that sort of jogs a memory. But no, I never kept any kind of a journal.
I don't.
You don't journal?
I don't.
Okay.
And my mother didn't either. She makes up stories as something affects her. She would make up a story, and then the next day she would tell it to us, the children, and then she would tell the story and perfect it, and over and over again, it becomes almost like written down.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We have one guest in the audience that has indicated that they are writing about her father's life and the son he left behind during World War II. Her father told her his story, but as she's writing it, does she write this in her voice as told to her, or does she write it from her father's voice? What are your thoughts on that?
This is a tough question. Okay, my book is completely in my mom's voice, although the author of the book is my name. And the reason I did that is that, okay, at first I thought, okay, it will have to be a biography because I'm writing about somebody else. I'm writing about her. But then it didn't sound right because my mom had such a beautiful voice. And she was talking in Chinese, so it's a very refreshing and unique voice. And she loved poetry. She's so poetic. From time to time, she would spew it out, both in Chinese and English. She loves Wordsworth, and she would be spewing out poetry in her narrative and stuff like that. And I just had to make it in her voice. So I wrote everything in her voice. I was going to interject my voice and say one chapter in her voice and one chapter in my voice, saying, what I'm doing with her. But then the editor read it, and she said it very politely. She said, "Your mother's voice is so refreshing, so good. I don't think your voice fits in there." Meaning, shut up and let your mother talk. So I took out all my chapters. However, I have read a very good memoir, The Color of Water, which is written by James McBride, which is one chapter in her mother's voice, one chapter in his voice. It's basically about his mother, a Jewish woman, married to an African American and had like a dozen children, and how they were raised. And so he had it, one chapter her voice and one chapter his. And that worked out very well. So it's anything you feel is right. There is no formula, there's no right or wrong. It's whatever you think is best.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to ask my fellow volunteer, Lily, if she's still on with us, if she could take a quick run through the questions or comments that are in the chat box, because we're going to run out of time here shortly, and pick out the one or two that may be most important. And while Lily's doing that, the other question that I had was if you could repeat or share the information on plot essential elements again. I don't know if you want to share your screen on the essential elements of a plot.
There we go.
So it has to do with the developing the character, identifying the problem, identifying the struggle, what the revelation is, as well as the resolution. Does that require any additional comments from either one of you?
Basically, it's when you read a novel, any novel will have all of these elements. And what we're trying to say is that a memoir is also a story and should have all these elements too.
Very good, thank you. I'm doing a quick run through the chat, and I'm going to ask you one other question, and that is, how long have the two of you been together? Because you work very well together.
Well, as I said, we have been married for 32 years, but the joint writing didn't start until maybe 5 years ago, something like that. Before that, I was the editor of a small publication, Retirees of the Road Bank, and at that time I used Veronica as my sounding board and editor. She would occasionally give me something to read, comment on, but as a joint project, I would say about 5 years.
And then towards well, we weren't very serious about it, we just did it whenever we feel like it. But during the lockdown, there was nothing else to do.
Yeah, true.
So we were locking ourselves down, and after a while, we did not feel like it's a lockdown because we were so busy and we were running between our two rooms and discussing. So that was a great way to spend a pandemic lockdown.
Okay. Lily, are you still with us? And any comments you have? We are coming down to the wire.
Yes, absolutely. There's been so much great feedback in the chat about this session. May I just take time to read what Laura Thompson had said, which she said was great teaching and sharing course and free. So thank you so much. And that both Sverrir and Veronica are fascinating people, and they have all loved listening to your stories. So thank you, AARP Virginia. Thank you, Trudy, for always being the best moderator. And Veronica and Sverrir, I think you've goaded a lot of us to start writing our memoirs. Thank you.
Yes, I could spend all day listening to both of you. So on behalf of AARP Virginia, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon and express our gratitude to both of you and spending your valuable time and sharing your expertise with us. In the chat box, we are going to put a link to a survey. If you could take a moment and let us know your feedback on today's program. That link will also be in the follow-up email that includes the recording of this program. If you enjoyed this program, and I cannot believe you didn't enjoy this program, we invite you to join us for many of our other programs as well. You can see a full calendar of our events at www.aarp.org/virtual VA. Again, you'll find the schedule of events at aarp.org/virtual VA. This has been absolutely amazing, and thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise, and your knowledge with us on this program. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll see you next Tuesday, 3 o'clock East Coast time. Have a great afternoon. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.